Before I ever had a hysterectomy, I actually tried another treatment for my fibroids. I had a uterine artery embolization, or UAE/UFE, in my early 40s. And here's the interesting part. Years later, I still had a hysterectomy. Now, before you hear that and think, well, then the UAE must not have worked. No, it absolutely worked for me. In fact, if I had to make that decision again, knowing everything I know now, I would still have had the UAE. So today I want to tell you about what the procedure was actually like, what that recovery was like, how well it worked for me, and how I went from having a UAE in my early 40s to eventually having a hysterectomy in my 50s. What's up to my favorite bunch of beauties? If you're new here, I'm Denise. Welcome back to Beauty Over Age, where we talk about all things power, peace, and purpose after 40. And if you've watched my fibroid surgery or hysterectomy videos, this is actually a pretty important piece of my story that I haven't really talked about, because I didn't go straight from having fibroids to having a hysterectomy. There were a whole lot of years in between. I was in my early 40s and I had a fibroid that was about the size of a grapefruit. And my periods were heavy. I hadn't gone through a whole lot of treatments before that for my fibroids, but what I did was I sat down with my gynecologist, we talked about what was going on, and we discussed my options. At the time, I was still pretty far away from menopause. My doctor explained the uterine artery embolization to me and told me that the idea was to cut off the blood supply that was feeding the fibroid. Without that blood supply, the fibroid would eventually die and shrink. And hopefully, as the fibroid shrank, the bleeding and the other symptoms that I was having would improve. Now, that sounded reasonable to me, so I decided to do it. The next step was meeting with an interventional radiologist. They reviewed my ultrasound, they looked at what's going on with the fibroid, and they agreed that I was a good candidate for the procedure. And then came the procedure day. Now, when somebody says this is a minimally invasive procedure, I don't want you to hear that and think that you're going to stroll in there, have a little something done, and stroll back out. That, at least, was not my story. I went into the hospital and was prepped very much like I was having surgery. I had a urinary catheter placed. I was sedated. And this was long enough ago that I don't honestly remember whether I had general anesthesia or what type of sedation they used. After that, I was taken in for the procedure. What I remember being explained to me at the time was that they would put these little seeds into the uterine artery to block the blood flow from the fibroid. After that procedure, I stayed in the hospital overnight. And because somebody considering this procedure is probably going to ask, did it hurt? Yes. Yes, it did. They anticipated that I was going to have pain, so I had a pain pump. And when I tell you that I used the pain pump, I used that pump. I was pressing that button. And there were times when my nurse was also giving me additional pain medication in between what I was getting from the pain pump. So I'm not going to sit here and tell you that my UAE recovery was painless, because it wasn't. The first part of recovery was painful for me. Once I went home, I had hydrocodone for pain and I had a stool softener. And for those first couple of days, hydrocodone and I were very good friends. But here's what surprised me. Even though those first days were painful, it really wasn't very long before I was up and moving around again. From what I remember, within about 3 days or so, I was starting to get up and about. I also had some bleeding after the procedure, but for me, it was more like a light period. And then it sort of tapered over the following days. So there was definitely a rough beginning, but the recovery didn't drag on and on, at least not for me. This is where I think my story is important, because when I tell people that I eventually had a hysterectomy, it would be very easy to assume that the UAE didn't work. It did. My periods improved tremendously. The pain that I had been experiencing with my periods improved tremendously. And that improvement lasted for years. I went through the rest of my 40s with a huge improvement in the symptoms that I had that led me to the treatment in the first place. So when I evaluate whether my UAE was successful, I am not evaluating it based on what happened in my 50s. I am looking at all of those years in between. And for those years, it gave me relief. And if conversations like this are helpful to you, go ahead and subscribe to Beauty Over Age. We talk about the things that women experience in midlife that we should really be talking about more. Now, let me tell you what happened when I got into my 50s, because this is where the story takes a turn. By then, I was having some new problems. I started feeling like I wasn't completely empty in my bladder. I had some discomfort, and I also experienced some postmenopausal bleeding. But the way I actually found out that there was a large fibroid there was almost accidental. I had gone to a chiropractor because of my back. They took some x-rays, and there on this x-ray was this huge calcified mass. I remember looking at this thing like, what the hell is that? I showed the x-ray to a friend of mine who's a nephrologist. She looked at it and basically said, that's a calcified fibroid. And then she told me I needed to get it evaluated. Now I'm in my 50s. I'm postmenopausal. I'm having these symptoms. And suddenly I'm looking at this huge calcified fibroid on an x-ray. So now I had a completely different decision to make than the one that I had in my 40s. At this point, I had already gone through menopause. I wasn't trying to preserve my uterus for pregnancy. And my thinking was basically, why am I keeping this uterus? I talked to my gynecologist. She agreed. I talked to my primary care doctor. He agreed as well. And ultimately, I chose to have the hysterectomy. That became a whole journey. And if you see my other videos, you know I've talked about it quite a bit on this channel. But I don't look back at that hysterectomy and think, see, I should have never bothered with the UAE. I don't feel that way at all. Knowing that I eventually had a hysterectomy anyway, yes, I would still choose the UAE, because I don't think we can judge a treatment only by whether we eventually needed another treatment years later. I had years of significantly improved bleeding, years of significantly improved period pain. And during that stage of life I was in at the time, that mattered. The decision that made sense for me in my early 40s did not have to be the same decision that made sense for me after menopause. And I think that sometimes we forget that when we're making decisions about our health. It doesn't necessarily have to be which choice will solve this forever? Sometimes the question is, which choice makes the most sense for my body and my life right now? For me, in my early 40s, that was UAE. And for me, years later after menopause, that answer became hysterectomy. Both of those decisions can be true. And I want to make something very clear. This is my experience with uterine artery embolization. Your fibroids, your symptoms, where your fibroids are located, your age and health history, whether you want future pregnancies, all of those things can affect what treatment options make sense for you. So, if you're dealing with fibroids, talk to your healthcare provider about your options. And if you're interested in UAE, ask whether a consultation with an interventional radiologist might make sense for you. But I wanted to tell you this part of my story because hysterectomy was not my first fibroid treatment. And even though I eventually ended up having one, I still don't regret the UAE. Those years of relief counted, and I would make that choice again. If you've had UAE or you're considering it, I especially want to hear from you in the comments. And if you had fibroids and you chose a completely different treatment, tell us about that too, because I think women need to hear just how many different paths our stories can take. Until next time, keep choosing your power, protecting your peace, and walking in your purpose. And I will see you in the next video.